Today we're looking at the question: was Jesus Christ a historical figure? It just almost goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that if Jesus Christ was not a historical figure, then everything we're doing here is worthless, maybe even harmful. If Jesus Christ was not a historical figure, there was no resurrection, there was no crucifixion to lead to the resurrection, there were no miracles, there was none of this if Jesus Christ was not a historical figure. And yet, nowadays, we will hear people come out with the statement, with the allegation that Jesus Christ was just a myth or a legend or a fairy tale. And I don't believe that's what the evidence says. I believe there's historical evidence that Jesus Christ was a historical figure, and we're going to look at some of that evidence today. So is it possible, it gets right down to the question, is it possible that Jesus Christ is merely a legend, a myth, or a fairy tale? As I said already, if he is, or if he was, then we're not saved. There's no salvation in him any more than there would be through any other lie. And yet D. James Kennedy, a man that I used to listen to regularly when he was alive, wrote a book called Why I Believe. And even though he's a very strong, passionate Christian, I don't think it was an overstatement when he wrote this, that the evidence for the historicity of Christ, and historicity is a big word, it just means that it is historical fact. The evidence for the historicity of Christ is so great, I know of no historian in the free world who would dare place his or her reputation on the chopping block by denying that Jesus Christ ever existed. Okay? And at first, that sounds like a pretty big statement. I mean, really, you're going to say nobody would put their reputation on the chopping block, and certainly there are some people out there who still try to make the case. But I think he makes a good point that very few people, even secular historians, will say that he didn't exist. Most historians will agree he did exist. Now, they stop short of where they need to be on that he was who he said he was. And I want to caution you as we go through some of this evidence today that we don't try to make the evidence say more than what it does. What I'm going to present to you today, I believe, demonstrates that Jesus Christ was a historical figure. Now, the fact that he was mentioned by these guys in historical record does not prove in and of itself that he was the Son of God. Now, I still believe that's the case, and I believe there's evidence from the Bible for that, but just these historical records don't prove that he was the Son of God. But if he didn't exist, he couldn't be the Son of God in the first place. So having this evidence that he existed is really the first step in proving that he was who he said he was. And before we go too much further, I want to give you a note about sources as well. As we look at this, a lot of the material comes from, I hope I say his name right, but Edwin Yamauchi. And he was, I think he's retired now, but he was a professor at Miami University in Ohio, and very well-respected scholar of the history of Christ, of the ancient documents, even among secular historians. The man was an evangelical Christian. Honestly, I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he was an evangelical Christian, and yet he was the go-to guy when people wanted to know about the ancient documents surrounding the time of Christ. They would go and talk to Edwin Yamauchi. But he says, the Gospels are excellent sources. As a matter of fact, they're the most trustworthy, complete, and reliable sources for Jesus. Doesn't it make you feel good to hear somebody in a university say that? For once not running down the Gospels. They're the most trustworthy, complete, and reliable sources for Jesus. The incidental sources really don't add much detailed information. However, they are valuable as corroborative evidence. And what that means is we don't want to give the idea that we don't know enough about Jesus from the Gospels, or if we're looking at these outside sources, it means we don't think the Gospels are trustworthy. I believe, as hopefully I've presented to you the last few months that we've gone over this, I believe the Gospels are absolutely trustworthy. And so these sources aren't brought in because the Gospels aren't trustworthy, but they're brought in to give evidence to those who are still skeptical that there is good reason to believe the picture that the Gospels paint of Jesus Christ. It would be as though, say, I was on trial for murder. Say they were accusing me of murdering somebody in Tulsa. Now, and I say Tulsa for a reason, because there's a turnpike between here and there. And they had me on camera at the toll booth on the Cherokee Turnpike on the day in question. Now, me being on camera heading toward Tulsa right before the murder, That would not prove in and of itself that I had murdered anybody when I was in Tulsa, but it's corroborative evidence saying, yes, he was on his way to Tulsa when that happened. It's kind of the same thing. In and of themselves, what we're going to talk about today doesn't prove who he was, but it backs up what the Gospels, which are the ultimate source, it backs up what the Gospels say about who he was. So we've got a few places where there's historical evidence for Christ outside the Gospels. If you remember back to last time I talked about Josephus. His longer name is Titus Flavius Josephus, but we'll just call him Josephus today. He was a Jewish military commander in the latter half of the 1st century A.D. And what that means is between about 50 and 100 A.D., they had a lot of skirmishes between the Jews and the Romans because, as we know, during the time of Christ, the Romans were in charge of Judea, and the Jews didn't like it. There were the groups called the Zealots who tried to overthrow the Romans. That's what some of the people thought Jesus was there for, to set up an earthly kingdom and throw the Romans out. Well, Josephus was one of the Jewish military commanders. He ended up being defeated around AD 67, and after that he became a collaborator with the Romans. So he was not popular among his own people. He was kind of like Benedict Arnold, that, hey, once I don't get exactly where I need to be, I'm going to go over to the other side. And so he began to work with the Romans, and on their behalf, really, he wrote extensively on the history of the Eastern Mediterranean area. And so when it comes to the history of, say, Judea or Israel, Lebanon, Syria, that whole area, Josephus was the historian who wrote about that whole area of the world so the Romans would have a historical record of what had gone on. And it's important to note in this that Josephus was not a Christian. Okay? We will look at some Christian sources today because I don't think just because somebody's a Christian, they automatically become untrustworthy. Otherwise, I have no business being up here. But when it comes to the historical evidence for Jesus, if everything was written by Christians, well, then it might be suspect. But it makes a strong case that I think the skeptic can't really ignore when we have all this historical evidence, all this historical record of the existence of Christ, and it was written by non-Christian sources, people who had no reason to claim that he existed if he didn't. He wrote several things. One of them was the Antiquities of the Jews. And in the Antiquities of the Jews, he corroborates the fact that Jesus lived and ministered. So him writing about Jesus gives us a glimpse from a Jewish and Roman perspective, someone who was not a Christian, someone who rejected Christ as his Messiah, who still said, yes, this man existed and walked and ministered the way the Gospel said he did. And what's recorded today in the Antiquities of the Jews says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. Now I read this, and even as a Christian, even as someone who wants to make a case for the historical Jesus Christ, something about this is fishy to me. Because knowing what I know about Josephus was not a Christian. And for him to say Jesus is the Messiah and yet not accept him, when he says he's the Christ, he's saying he's the Messiah. And for a Jewish writer to say he's the Messiah, but then not be a Christian, makes no sense to me. For Josephus to admit the resurrection and not be a Christian makes no sense to me. And what has in all likelihood happened here is that some well-meaning but misguided Christian later on added some things to what Josephus wrote, okay, because it's just so glaring. Now, I still don't believe people added things to the Gospels later because everything seems to make sense where it goes. But it does not make sense to me that Josephus would say such high things, such wonderful things about Christ when he didn't accept him as the Messiah. And so there are even before I read that there was a controversy, I thought, there are some things that just don't belong in here. And I started making a list of crossing out things that I thought he probably wouldn't say. And as I've looked at both Christian and secular scholars, their lists are all pretty close together and pretty close together with my list. And I think we can, knowing about Josephus, we can piece together what he probably would have said. So a less controversial rendering of this passage, more in line with his own rejection of Christ, might read, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, He was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. And you may say, Brother Jared, you're taking out the resurrection, you're taking out the miracles, you're taking out this and that. No, folks, my belief in the miracles, my belief in the resurrection is not dependent on Josephus. My belief in the resurrection and the miracles and everything else that Jesus did that proved he was the Son of God is dependent on what the Bible tells me. But we can look at this and make a reasonable conclusion about what Josephus, as a non-believing historian, could have said. And it doesn't indicate here that Josephus believes he's the Son of God, but it still confirms that Jesus Christ existed, that he had a following, that he was crucified, all of these things in line with what the Gospels say about him. Just the very fact that he's mentioned here by a historian within about 30 years of when he would have lived is some of the best evidence we have for the fact that he lived and existed at the time that the Gospels said he did. And even though that in and of itself, as I've said, does not prove he's the Son of God, it begins to make the case, because if he doesn't exist, he can't be the Son of God. And yet the evidence shows he did exist. He also wrote in Antiquities, and all of this sort of indirectly contributes to corroborating what the Gospels say, because it talks about other people who were involved in the Gospels, other people who were involved in the ministry of Jesus Christ. He corroborates the ministry of John the Baptist, who we know was the forerunner of Christ. And he wrote, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist." So when the Jews when Herod's army was destroyed, some of the Jews in their day thought it was because of what he did to John the Baptist. Well, that can't be true if there was no John the Baptist, but there was a John the Baptist. "For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another, and piety toward God, and so to come to baptism." Okay? So he confirms the ministry that the Gospels tell us that John the Baptist had as a forerunner and as someone who would point the Jews to Jesus Christ. In this same book, he talks about James, who we know from the New Testament to be the brother of Jesus, and also the fact that early on they believed that he was the Son of God. And this goes to disprove the idea that people will say, oh, when people started to believe he was the Son of God, that was just a belief they invented much, much later. For Josephus to say this within 30 years, is to demonstrate that very early on, the people who knew him best said, yes, this man is the Son of God. He writes, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So Annas assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Christ, who was brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others." So he affirms there again Christ. He affirms the existence of James and the fact that they followed him. "And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." And so he affirms the fact that James was there, and James followed him, that James followed Jesus Christ, and so many others did as well. And we know that the reason they followed Jesus Christ is not just that he was a good teacher. There are lots of good teachers, but if they'd been killed on the cross, I mean, that's kind of humiliating to follow a man who got himself killed in the most horrifying and humiliating, demeaning way in their view. There was something else. They believed he was the Son of God and that he was risen again. Now we move on from Josephus, in case you were tired of looking at him. Tacitus, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, I believe his name is. He's a member of the Roman Senate, so he was one of the Roman elites. He wrote very extensively on the history of the Roman Empire, so much so that he was considered to be the greatest of all Roman historians. This is not just some obscure historian writing about obscure things. This was the man to go to for a record of what happened during the Roman times. He was also not a Christian. As a Roman, he was a follower of the Roman pagan philosophies. He wrote books called a collection of works called the Annals. I believe the long term of it is the Annals of Imperial Rome, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. In this, he corroborates the existence of Christ, the historical fact of his crucifixion, and the fact that very early on people believed in his resurrection. He wrote in the Annals, "Hence to suppress the rumor." Now this, when he says the rumor, it was the rumor that Jesus Christ was alive again. He refers to the rumor. Another man later on refers to a mischievous superstition. They're talking about belief in the resurrection. "Hence to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the persons commonly called Christians. He's speaking of the emperor here. The persons commonly called Christians who were hated for their enormities. So in order to bring to an end this superstitious, scary idea that Jesus Christ was alive again, the Roman emperor falsely charged Christians of crimes, punished them with, even Tacitus, who was not a Christian, looks at the torture and says this was gruesome stuff. He calls it the most exquisite tortures and says that these people were hated for their enormities. The churches were growing. They were multiplying. Christus, the founder of that name, was put to death as a criminal by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but also through the city of Rome also, whither all things horrible and disgraceful flow. Speaking about his own city here, by the way, calls Rome a cesspool, basically, of all the worst ideas in the world. From all quarters as to a common receptacle, and where they are encouraged. Accordingly, first those were seized who confessed they were Christians. Next, on their information, a vast multitude were convicted, not so much on the charge of burning the city as of hating the human race.